Studying habits is one of the top questions I have from my parents. Particularly, how do I help them to study better and stop waiting to the last minute? Because let's face it, reading over notes and hoping to memorize every single detail the night before a test usually don't work out too well. And we're not usually taught how to study in high school. I'm going to share 5 study tips that you can use to avoid the last minute cram and score higher on your exam. Tip number 1, take breaks. The Pomodoro technique is a technique that alternates 25 minutes of focused study and 5-minute breaks. Research variations to this technique depends on what you're doing, such as working on problems or writing papers. Then it's recommended by researchers to use 50 minutes intense work sessions followed by a 10-minute break. I prefer to set my timer for 50 minutes, then set it again for a 10-minute break. Whichever way you decide to do it, the goal is to have intense, distraction-free work sessions. For some, this may mean having music playing in the background. For others, it may need to be completely quiet. Even the room temperature needs to be just right. And again, no distractions from your cell phone. You can use apps like Focus Me to silence your phone and keep your power sessions, power sessions. Another key thing about the Pomodoro technique is that during breaks, get up, walk around, stretch, even if it means just changing scenery by walking down the hall and back. You want to make the most of your breaks, but most of all, do not forget to set your timer. Study tip number 2, active recall. Active recall is actively being engaged in studying, which is the opposite of passively reading your notes or just looking at terms on a page. For example, when studying vocabulary, instead of reading the terms and definitions in your notes, cover the definitions and try to guess them before reading them. And if you use flashcards, give your brain time to come up with the definition on its own before flipping it over. And with our notes, sometimes reading those is like reading a textbook. And how many of you remember, let alone understand, every single thing that's in your chemistry or science textbooks? So you want to give your brain time to recall and process the information that's in your notes. One way to do this is with a technique called blurting. With blurting, you take a topic and you write down everything you remember about that topic. And I mean, go deep into what you remember. Then compare what you've written to your notes. This will show you what you know and what gaps you need to fill. And if you don't want to tackle a topic at once, you can always read a small chunk of your notes at a time. Sometimes only a couple of sentences, depending on how long and information-packed those sentences are. Then explain it to a sibling or a cousin or a parent the same way a teacher would explain it to the class. Not ready for the class lesson? Then write or type it out as if you are explaining it to a class. Then, just like with blurting, compare what you've written to your notes to see what you know and the gaps you need to fill. I personally prefer the blurting method because it gives your brain the most time to recall on its own before reading. But the chunking method also works well when you're dealing with a lot of complicated or confusing, complex information. Tip number 3. Like tip number 2 with active recall, we don't want to just read the problems and leave it at that. You want to actually work more problems. There are a ton of online practice problems and quizzes for both chemistry and physics. And if you prefer worksheets, you can find these with answer keys as well. Just remember to solve the problems first, then check the answer. There are 2 places I like to go for online practice problems. For chemistry, check out chemquiz.net. That's CHEMQUIZ.net. And for physics, check out the Physics Classroom. There you'll find practice problems and tutorials. And if you scroll down, not only will you see the answer, but you will see how to solve the problems as well. Another thing to keep in mind when working practice problems that is very tempting to push the harder problems to last. Try to avoid this. Go ahead and work those most difficult problems, especially when you know they are likely to show up on your exam. You want to provide the most time for those, and then the easier problems, don't ignore those. Come back and review those just to make sure that you have all the gaps filled. Tip number 4, set a study schedule. Studying is one of the activities that we push off till later. And before you know it, the test is tomorrow and you have about 2 months of material to study. Creating a schedule for what to study and when will help to avoid those last-minute all-night binges. In an ideal world, you will review your notes the same day that you have class. This works great for students on an alternating block schedule where you have 2 to 3 classes per week and you only have half of your classes each day. But this can be challenging if you have class every day or you have anything else that you do like work or extracurricular activities. In those cases, I recommend setting each subject at least twice a week with a 90-minute to 2-hour block. And the more activities my students are into, the more likely they had to spend a few more hours on the weekend to stay on top of things. Tip number 5, spaced repetition. There's actually a graph called the forgetting curve. And this graph shows how long we retain the information after we learn it. The first time, you forget most of the information right after you learn it. As you review the information, you get a recharge, so to speak, and start back at the top, forgetting less information as time passes. The more you review, the more you retain, allowing you to space out the need to review that same information. So this curve shows that spacing out repeated reviews of the same information increases our retention. So what does this tell us about studying? It tells us that you want to review the same information more frequently at first, then space it out more as it takes up station in your brain. So for new information, you may study that every week for a few weeks. Then, as you begin to remember the details, you can skip a week, then skip a couple of weeks, which is great because we're generally always adding new information with each new class. And this makes review at the time of exam that much easier because if we've been following this process each time we study, we'll know the information from the first part of the exam period and only need to review it to keep it fresh for the exam. This will allow more time for us to study newer information. No one technique works on its own for everyone. We need a combination of them based on our goals, our purpose, and basically what works best for us. And remember, it is very important to create a study schedule and stick to it to avoid the last-minute cram. I hope you found these tips helpful, and as always, thank you for watching.